This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome into the podcast, everyone. I'm Randy Moore. I'm the associate pastor here at Methodist Temple, joined as always by the lead pastor at the Methodist Temple, Pastor Andy Payton. And we get together once a week like this. It's not the only time we get together, but we get to probably have some of our most extended conversations. And what I'd like to say, and I'm being honest and true, this is a true statement, I mean, this is a legitimate conversation, right? This is what it is.
Yeah. We sit down and talk.
Yeah. It is forced because we know we want to do it once a week, but it is real. It's as real as we can make it.
We have notes. I mean,
right.
Just to be transparent, we have notes, but the conversation goes all kinds of different directions. And
yeah.
I find that fun.
Yeah.
It's fun. Yeah.
And we always start with this soul check-in. It's interesting because we've mentioned more than once that the reason why we do that is because it goes back to John Wesley and it goes back to the examination of his pastors. And I just got my letter about my fall interview, and there's a questionnaire, and it comes every year. And the first question always has to do with the condition of your soul. But this year it was really edited down. It's just simply, how's your soul? It's not, how does your soul prosper? How is it with your soul? How's your soul? So there it is. And as we've noted, it's always a good question to ask. And as I was driving in today, I was thinking, in anticipation of asking myself the question and you, it usually ends up me describing how I feel. But it's got to be more than feelings, right? It's got to be more than feelings.
We're talking about our life with God.
Yeah,
that's what Wesley is interested in.
Yeah.
When they got together in those small groups and they would ask the question, how is it with your soul? And we've talked about this before in our podcast, but really what they were getting at in those, they called them classes. In those classes, they were like, how is your life with God? And so it was encouraging testimony. It was encouraging reflection on how you're doing in terms of your spiritual practices, these kinds of things. And so it was much deeper than just simply our emotions.
And if you're living it out, really the question doesn't even have to be, how is it with your soul or how is it with your life with God? It's, how is it? Mm-hmm. How's your life? Mm-hmm. Because that's what life is.
So I understand it. Yeah, I mean, we live in a spiritual universe, and it didn't come from nothing. It came from God. And by virtue of being alive, we're spiritual people.
So, I think my soul is doing well. My practices are there. Could they be better? Yes. But I think it's good. I think it's good. How about you?
In terms of my spiritual life, I'm getting a lot out of reading the Daily Office, particularly reading the daily gospel lesson. If you've never heard of the Daily Office, just Google it, Daily Office, and you'll see that there's a series of readings that the church has assigned for every particular day. Some days actually have multiple, they have the Daily Office readings, but then they'll recognize, in some Christian traditions, they'll recognize certain saints, so certain days where they remember people like St. Francis, people like that anyway. But I like to read the daily gospel. I get a lot out of that.
I was really interested in how interested our staff was because you used something from the Daily Office in our staff meeting yesterday, and our staff people were really interested in that.
Yeah, well,
they were curious about it.
They were very curious. I think there's this longing right now for, there's so much going on in our world. Let's just be honest. As we look at the international situation, it feels like the world is on fire with violence, and then we have the election coming up, and there's obviously division there. And I think when you start talking about something that's ancient and withstood the test of time, it's got this anchoring type of quality. Mm-hmm. And so when we come along and, we're talking about, we read the Daily Office, and the church has been reading this lesson for, I don't know how many centuries it is, but it's just, I think there's just something that's secure in that. So.
Yeah. I don't know whether this is going to connect in with what we're going to talk today, but it probably will. But it's on my mind. In my Sunday school class, and we do a similar thing in my Sunday school class, we reflect on the service and on the sermon. And we were talking about church and church membership being in decline, even though we, right here, where we worship, we're bucking that trend and we're growing. But I went around the room and I said, I think I know the answer to this, but how many of you, if you're not Cradle Methodist, you're Cradle Christians, it was everyone. And I often wonder, like, because we are in decline and now it's down to like 21%, church participation, how do we let people know? This is one of those big questions that's just spring on you. But how do we know that we kind of have the answer to this yearning, like this interest in the offices, for someone who's doesn't have any background in it? Now, there were people who were in the church, grew up in it, left it for whatever reason, and came back to it, but they knew what they were coming back to. I mean, but how do we reach and how do we have a message to those who don't have any of that background? And why would they ever set foot in a church to think that there might be a connection to something larger than them and powerful and loving and transforming? Mm-hmm. You don't have to answer. I mean, I know it's the big question.
Well, it's the pressing question when it comes to the faith. Absolutely. I mean, I have some opinions about it, sure. I think about our church vision statement here at Methodist Temple. We say we strive to be a safe and non-judgmental community where folks can connect, share their gifts, and explore what God is doing in their lives. Those three verbs, connect, share, explore, that's really an approach to evangelism. It's baked in. It was intentionally done, actually. It's baked into who we say we are as a congregation. And so the idea came from an author by the name of Diana Butler Bass. Mm. And a few years ago, she wrote a book. I can't remember the name of the book, but the thing I remember about it was she talked about the playbook of the church 50 or 60 years ago was believe like us, behave like us, then you can belong with us. Mm. And so essentially the playbook was if you build it, they will come. Mm-hmm. And then you can belong as long as you check the right boxes, that kind of thing. That was very much a world where the culture around Christianity was we were the home team. Today things have changed, obviously. And so what Bass does, as she says, it's time to flip it. Instead of believe, behave, and belong, it's belong, behave, and then believe. And so the idea is it's time for the church to adopt really a missionary mindset. And in some ways, that's good news. I would argue we, the church, have always done our best work when we're the underdog. So I know that we lament the fact that participation is down, but that can be good news because if there's not very many of us, then there's not very many of us doing it either necessarily. And so the idea for Bass, though, is you go into the world, you develop relationships with people, you belong. In the midst of those relationships, you behave as a Christian should. Really what that entails, I think, is you definitely want to be there for people in the midst of their suffering. And as a result of those relationships that we develop in intentional ways outside of the church, we may earn the right to talk about why it is we do the things that we do. Mm-hmm. And so rather than belong, behave, and believe, belong, behave, and believe, at Methodist Temple we use connect and share and explore. And so I would say there's some form of that. Mm-hmm. We, the church, need to understand, as the old hymn says, I am the church, we are the church together. It's the people, that kind of thing. We have to understand that wherever we go, Christ goes too, and whoever accepts that love that we share with him is really Christ's love in a sense. And I know that's a radical thing to say maybe for some people, but it's really not. That's what makes us Christian. Christians believe that God has chosen to work through human persons. And so if you're a believer, if you're a person that trusts in Christ, then we believe that the Holy Spirit is working within us. And so when we go out and intentionally share love with others, we're sharing the love of Christ in a very tangible way. And hopefully over time, as we do that consistently, that opens up opportunity for conversation. So anyway, that's maybe that's more than you were looking for, but
No, pretty good answer for a pop quiz, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, really good.
Yeah. We're moving right now. And so we've sold our older house and moved to a new house. And the hardest part about it has been moving out of our neighborhood.
Oh, yeah.
And what was so humbling is people coming up to us saying, you have been such good neighbors to us. I mean, we live in our old neighborhood has a lot of retirees in it, and they suffer. I mean, they experience a lot of loneliness.
Sure.
And we made a point to be there for them, a lot of them. And we know them by name, and we've been there for 9 years. And so I think that's a way that we have been sharing the love of Christ with people. And I have had spiritual conversations over the course of my 9 years there.
Okay, and that was in the sermon. Okay, so let's transition then.
Yeah.
And some of this is going to come together. Okay, we're finishing up an October sermon series on community. And then this last Sunday, which was last Sunday, was on hospitality. Your text, and this was just really one of texts you referenced. It's not as if you just broke down this one particular text, but this was the sermon text, came from Hebrews chapter 13, 1 through 3. And the title of this in my Bible was Service Well-Pleasing to God. And the text says this: let mutual affection continue. Another translation said love. So let mutual affection continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. And then you opened by defining hospitality as the movement from something we get to something we give.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The way I described it was hospitality is really a form of community. And it starts to happen whenever our understanding of community goes from something we get, and instead it becomes something we give away. It becomes our way of life. And a lot of times, we all know it, that when people will say, hey, I'm looking for a community, they're really looking for something they get. But really, the Christian understanding of it, if you really stop and look at a passage like you just read, Randy, community is, no. It's something we do. We offer to people. Anyway, yeah.
And then this is radio, so to speak. We don't have video or pictures here, but your image was this ruler of growth. Mm-hmm. And so we don't just have that automatically. We grow into it, and it is a process. And you mentioned stages, and the first stage of this growth is feeling drawn to the warmth of a church family.
Yeah, so, the stages that I uses the language of the church. It doesn't necessarily have to just apply to the church necessarily, but, I'm a pastor and we're Christians, so we're going to use that kind of language. So, yeah, usually community starts with an experience of loneliness. Mm-hmm. I feel drawn to be in community and connection with others. Sometimes that's a church family. Sometimes it could be other forms of community. And so if you are experiencing loneliness, the way I've been describing it in this sermon series is that doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with you. It's just God's calling you into community in a new way. And so it begins with that drawing, though, into community in some way. And then so next what happens after you do that in stage 2, you start to make you start to do some experimenting. In the church world, you go church shopping.
Right. Everybody does it.
And a lot of that happens online now, which, by the way, that's so critical for the church. How do we connect with the world? One big thing we need to worry about is online presence. That's a big one. That's where a lot of the evangelism is going to happen. And it's where people are going to experience a congregation first, too. Most folks are not just going to show up on a Sunday morning and say, let me check this place out. That's not going to be how it is. So anyway, you start to church shop, you look for a community, and then finally you begin to make that leap where you go to the place, wherever that may be. In our case, you come to the church in person for that first time. And over a period of time, really what happens in this middle stage is you start to feel at home. And in my sermon, I talked about how I think that takes a long time. You don't just show up at a church and be like, and most of the time you're like, voila, here I am. I feel at home now. You might feel comfortable, but it's going to take some time before you know people's names and kind of get the lay of the land and really feel secure. And so that middle stage 3, is you feel at home though. And then over time, as you learn people's names, you feel at home, you begin to welcome others. And particularly within the life of the church, you're growing when you're willing to be there for others when they're experiencing difficulties. And then finally, maturing when it comes to community is you go on that positive offense where you try to include new people within your life and your circle of caring, particularly folks that are different than us. So back to the passage, we welcome the strangers.
Mm-hmm. And you quoted a gentleman by the name of Parker Palmer. He had a couple of quotes, and one I really want to dig into a little bit because we were trying to interpret it and understand it in our Sunday school class. But the first one is, first of all, explain who Parker Palmer is.
So Parker Palmer is a speaker, a educator, social justice type of advocate, Christian man. And these quotes were born out of his experience of living more or less in a form of monastic community within the Quaker tradition, when the Quaker tradition is part of the Christian church. And so basically they kind of did manual labor. They lived in monastic community with one another. And these quotes that you're getting ready to share are born out of that experience. And so he's famous for these. The first quote particularly he's famous for when it comes to community. But the second quote you're getting ready to share, I think, Randy, gives a little more context to what he's getting at. So you can go ahead and share it and we can talk more about it.
Yeah, the first quote that you shared in your sermon was, true community is that place where the person you least want to live with always lives.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that a fun one?
They're both fun.
And then the second one says, Palmer learned that the degree to which a person yearns for community is directly related to the dimming of the memory of his or her last experience of it. Yes.
So this could be, I'm going to let you, go ahead.
No. The way I would explain it is he's saying stop with the comparisons. Stop it. If you really want to live in a relationship with people, then it starts with the people that are right in front of you. And most of the time, one of the greatest hurdles for living in relationship with people is you didn't let go of your former experience of community. And so if you're going to really be there for that person, particularly when it comes to the church, my goodness, this is huge. You're going to have to let go of whatever it was that it was. It might be that you've come from one congregation to another congregation. If you're going to be there for that new congregation, you have to let go of what was. If you've been a part of a congregation for a long time, then here's the thing. All congregations change over time. They're like people. We don't stay the same. We evolve. We change. Things become different. If you're really going to be there and experience the relationship in front of you, it means you're willing to dim your last experience of community. And a lot of times, let's be honest, we don't like that. Hence, Palmer says, community is that place where the person you least really want to be with is always there.
The context is helpful because now I can see this as it is, let's just say it's me. It would be me intentionally dimming, like you would dim your light, of the memory of his or her last experience of it. And as we were, bouncing this off of each other in Sunday school, and we get into all sorts of good discussion in there. That's what it's for. That's why it's so great, and that's why I love it. But you could also see this as, this may not be what he meant, but this is one of the things that came out, that he says he learned that the degree to which a person yearns for community is directly related to the dimming of the memory of his or her last experience of it, in that you yearn for what is gone because what is gone was so good. It dimmed. The individual didn't dim it, but it dimmed. But again, I'm going to go with you because you had all the context for this, and we had 2 quotes.
Well, he went from his life in the world to monastic community.
That's the context. Yeah.
That's the context.
Yeah.
And so he's leaving one way of life
Yes.
for a new way of life.
Yeah.
And a lot of our misery is associated with not grieving well when it comes to our community. And I'm in my mid-40s. I'm going to turn 45 next month. I grieve the past. There's some things about, when I was in my 20s or even younger, I miss. Yeah, I'm becoming that old person is like when I was a kid, that kind of thing. But he's talking about like it's natural to go through this too. But to find joy in community means you're willing to step over that and say, hey, I'm going to be there for this person right in front of me right now. And we're going to be in community together, in relationship together. And I'm not going to project my past onto that person and demand that they become something that's really not fair to them to become.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. I mean, I think you're going to have people who are looking at Parker Palmer this week.
Oh, if you want, what's his book? It's on Christian vocation. I think it's called Listen to Your Life. Okay. That's a great book if you're interested in checking him out. He's a good author, definitely. Anything he's written that I've read is very thoughtful.
Very good. Okay, and you said that all of this is really consistent with the basic biblical storyline.
Yeah. The way I would explain the overall biblical storyline starting in the book of Exodus is it's a story about a group of people who are looking for a home. They find the home, and then they're instructed by God to extend that home to others. That's the story of the Israelites. They were famously in Egypt in bondage and slavery. They cry out to God, hey, get us out of here. And then Moses comes along and takes them to the promised land, their new home. And then what happens when they get there is they're giving some very clear instructions. We call them commandments now, but they were instructions on what they should do now in their life in community with one another. And one of the big instructions that God gives in multiple places in the Hebrew Bible is extend home to other people. And so I used a passage from Leviticus and one from Deuteronomy. The one from Leviticus says, the alien who resides with you, shall be to you as a native born among you. Another translation of that passage is, the immigrant who resides with you shall be treated as a citizen among you. And you shall love the alien or immigrant as yourself, for you indeed were also aliens in the land of Egypt. So, in other words, remember what it was like when you were a foreigner. Remember what it was like when you didn't have a home, and treat people accordingly. And the passage from Deuteronomy essentially says the same thing. It starts off talking about how God loves the orphans and seeks justice for the widows, but also calls us to love the strangers. And so we shall love, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 19, it says, you shall love also the stranger, for you were strangers once in the land of Egypt too. And so those are 2 passages that often don't get lifted up when Deuteronomy or Leviticus is being used, but I think they really speak to the heart of what God was desiring for the Israelites. And so when you go to the New Testament, though, I find that what happens with Jesus and the disciples is he takes this same spirit of hospitality and intensifies it in new ways. The spirit of hospitality that we see in Christ and the disciples is not really just tied to a geographic place like it is in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It's more like a way of life that you take with you wherever you go. And of course, Jesus commissions even the disciples to go into the world. And particularly the early Christian movement goes into the Gentile world. So they're not waiting for community to come to them. They go to community, And so a couple of the passages I talked about was Matthew 25, where Jesus says, when I was a stranger, you welcomed me. And I always try to point out that that's the criteria for the final judgment. It's not your Christian orthodoxy or if you said the prayer right or got baptized the right way. Not that stuff's not important. I'm not going to say it's not important, not trying to dismiss it. But at the end of the day, what Jesus says is, famously, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. That's part of it. And then, of course, I referenced the Hebrews lesson that we talked about too, where people have welcomed strangers into their homes and entertained angels without even knowing it. So, yeah. But it is all over the place biblically.
Yes.
People say, I want a biblical faith. Well, newsflash, it's welcoming strangers and people who are different than us is a huge, massive part of what it means to be serious about the biblical faith.
And Matthew 25 needs to be rescued. I think, especially as Protestants, we have this, salvation by faith through grace, or grace through faith. And so, that Matthew passage
It pushes us against that idea.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah, it's the same Jesus. So,
Yeah. Well, I think we have to, as all things, there needs to be a balance.
Sure.
And God's steadfast love is always with us, absolutely. And really what happens when we talk about faith, we're becoming aware of that steadfast love, and we realize, hey, that steadfast love is being extended to the world through me. This is the chosen mechanism that this is how God has chosen to work. It's through me. And that essentially is that's what we mean by the body of Christ. I trust in God's steadfast love. I don't earn it, sure. But if we're really real about that, we become an extension of it into the world.
All right, and then you got real practical and asked the question, how do we practice hospitality? And you brought in maybe the biggest hitter, Oprah.
Oprah.com, man. So my extensive research led me to Oprah.com. I just Googled how to be a good host and how to practice hospitality, and Oprah came up, and I was like, okay, I don't know if I should do this. I'm going to read this article. But she had some good things to say about what it means to be a good host. And she says a good host gives their attention, of course, to their guest. They give their guest that which they know that the guest loves. But also a good host keeps their own heart closet in check. And so they don't practice hospitality to the point where they begin to resent their own practice of hospitality. Because let's be honest, there's nothing worse than a host that is resentful in their practice of it. So that's obvious. Like the first half of hospitality then is to be a good host. But there's another part of hospitality that I don't know about you, but I've never really heard people talk about this too much, but I think it's also very helpful to just acknowledge. There's the good host part, but there's also that part where we try to be a good guest. And a good guest is considerate of their host. A good guest is willing to share their needs, with the host. In terms of the church, one of the things I talked about in my sermon is, hey, if you're visiting here or you haven't been here for very long, you have fresh eyes. You're able to help us see our gaps that we don't see. So if you share your needs with us, that's very helpful. But then obviously a good guest doesn't trash the place either. And now within the life of the church, what's interesting is a lot of the times it's not the visitors that are rough on us. Mm-hmm. It's the people who have been here for a long time, and then the church has changed on them, and then they're not able to practice the Palmer wisdom of dimming their last experience of community so that they can experience the community in front of them again. And so a lot of times, I'm not saying this is always the case, but it can happen where a person gets angry, leaves the church, trashes the church, gossips about things to other people, and then that's just not Christian. Just call it out. That's not the way. Anyway.
Yeah. And so you're going to have to use another word picture here because you developed a game called Tic-Tac Hospitality.
Well,
you missed the alliteration, but you had to go somewhere.
I got to do something. As my grandfather says, well, you got to do something. I used a illustration to help people see how the practice of how they're doing in terms of their practice of hospitality, how I'm doing. And I invited people to imagine themselves like a tic-tac-toe board where they're in the middle, and then there's 8 boxes around you. And then in the congregation, I said, now look around you. Do you know the names of the 8 people around you? Do you know something about them beyond their name? And then I also applied it to your neighborhood. So where you live in terms of your home, do you know the names of the 8 people around you? And do you know something beyond their names? Very challenging to think about. And then The reason I believe it's important, I already kind of alluded to it. The reason I think it's important, though, is because we're Christians. And as Christians, we don't just believe in the God of heaven, but we also believe in the God of earth. In fact, that's our gospel message. The Word became flesh and made its dwelling among us. Jesus came. And in Jesus, what we see and what we're given is a picture of a God who works through human persons. And so by going out and learning the names of our neighbors and those around us, responding to their needs, really, back to your initial question, Randy, we are taking the love of Christ to them. And I know for a lot of people who have been a part of the church for a lot of their lives, that's something to consider, because we have family, a lot of us, that don't go to church and are probably not going to go to church. Let me just say that. But we can still take the love of Christ to them by being there for them and practicing the life that we all know that Christ has called us to.
You told a story, and we're going to have to wrap it up. I got to move on, and I know you do too. But you told a story that was powerful. So why don't you share that one, the Chesterton story? Okay.
So as we wrap it up, Chesterton has this parable where a businessman dies and goes to hell, and his business buddies start to miss him, and so they go knock on the gates of hell, and they say, "Hey, let him out. We miss him," and nothing happens. And then I think next the businessman's pastor comes down, knocks on the gates of hell, and says, "He wasn't that bad." and then finally his mom goes down and knocks on the gates of hell, and rather than say, "Let him out," she says, "Let me in." And I think that's a very vivid picture of what Christian hospitality really is about. It's not about, "Hey, come over here with me. Let me go to you, even if you're in hell." And certainly that's the picture of God we get in Jesus.
It's a great picture of motherhood too, right? And too many women get short shrift in the church. I mean, this is a picture of God as a woman.
Yeah. Well, and there is feminine language for God in the Bible.
Right.
We always talk about father, but God's mother too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely in the Bible as well.
But my own mom came to mind. I mean, and I'm not unique, right? I mean.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, I think about Leslie and our girls, and boy, she's on it now. I wish I could just, I don't know. What am I trying to say here?
You don't even have to say it.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's just inspiring. It's a challenge all at the same time.
Okay. And then this was you always leave the congregation, the family, the community, with a challenge, something to do. How are we going to put this to use? And you said, just be mindful that whoever you love, Christ loves. And Christ is loving others through you. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Very good. Quick service is the November topic.
Yep. And this particular Sunday coming up on November 3rd is going to be our All Saints Sunday. So we're going to talk about saints and service, which saints and service go together. And I plan on talking about, I'm going to use the story of Lazarus. I know that I initially said I was going to use something else, but the gospel lesson for All Saints Sunday is the story of Lazarus. And I can't help myself, because I think, that story, the imagery is such a powerful one. And when it comes to talking about our own transformation, that kind of thing. So yeah,
you get to make a late game switcheroo.
I've done that.
Switcheroo.
Oh, the staff just love it when I do that too.
So even though this is in ink, it's really in pencil.
The theme is saints and service and that kind of thing, as we get started with the whole month-long theme.
Very good. All right, Pastor Andy, good to be with you. And folks, it's good to be with you. Just know that you're invited to join us in whatever capacity that you can. We appreciate that you listen in, and we look forward to talking with you again next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.